Lurking in the shadows. Actual cannibal Nubatama. No, I'm just kidding. But this is the Nubatama deck profile from Team Absolution. Stick around. Welcome back, everybody, to another Team Absolution deck profile. I'm Doombringer Griffin, and you're here to see some ninjas. Don't believe all the hype, or do, totally up to you. But this deck coming in hot in Cardfight Vanguard Next, and hopefully going to do some exciting stuff in what little support it has so far. It seems to be doing pretty well, at least in the anime, when it gets to Trash Chrono. Praise! Or whoever it got. Hopefully it was Chrono. I think it was Chrono. But anyway, getting right into it, chat correct me. Here comes our trigger, Stealth Dragon Kurogane, nice and 2 crits, nice and vanilla. We have our foil crit, Stealth Dragon Noroi, 4 of, auto include. We have a Stealth Dragon Onibidoushi. I'm sorry, I just said that up. Onibidoushi. Doshi. Nope, had it right the first time. Alright. And he, being the special mechanic stand trigger, says After Image. So if you don't know what After Image does, it says when your opponent puts a bound card into his or her hand, if your hand has 6 or less cards, you may return this unit to your hand. And its other effect is Auto GB1. When this unit is placed on rearguard, if the number of cards in your hand is less than your opponent's, draw a card, return this unit to your deck, shuffle your deck, choose one of your other units, give it +3 until end of turn. So you get to cycle it out and put it back in the deck. I'm a fan of stand triggers that shuffle back. I like those kind of effects a lot, you know, putting more triggers in your deck, especially when you're in a deck that draws a lot of cards. This one, not so much, but in its current state, without a whole lot more support, you rely on triggers a lot to gain your advantage, as there's only so much you can do when you run out of discard or binding, whichever this clan's actual mechanic is. Ooh, nobody knows. And then we have Stealth Fiend Mashironmomen. You know, I might as well just put Marshmallow on it. It would have been a lot funnier. But he is a Malika clone or a Margle clone, either. He slides into the soul and gives something else 3k. I like the 6 crit 6 stand build at the moment. I've seen 12 crit, I've seen crits and draws, I've seen all rainbow, I've seen everything. So what this strategy hopes to do is really gain advantage out of the fact that most of your retires are free, and you can just bump off their rear guards temporarily. This doesn't really help except for interceptors, but if you can stand something up again, then finally put those things into the drop zone, they don't gain that advantage back, especially when they play all the cards with on-call effects. And finally, we've got the 4 heal triggers, the nice and new ones, the Stealth Rogue Shigure. And that does it for the trigger lineup. And just our starter, she or he, really hard to tell which. Stealth Rogue of the Wintry Win, Kamojigusa, Auto Forerunner, Rearguard After Image. Auto GB1, when this unit is placed on Rearguard Circle, you may play, your opponent chooses a card from his or her bind zone and puts it into his or her drop zone, and if the card was put, you countercharge 1. So this is kind of the fuel for your removal, I say in air quotes again, as this clan, with its less powerful clan mechanic, puts things either from the field or from the hand into the bind zone for low cost, but then has discard effects for higher or less frequent costs. So you can either use this with putting a rear guard away, such as from the bear that I'll show you later, or from using a stride effect, which puts things from the hand into the bind zone. Then you can use this to just come in, countercharge 1, and drop something into the drop zone. So this makes the advantage more permanent instead of temporary, but you also have to keep this on the board, and there's plenty of ways to get rid of a starter. So moving on from zeros and on to ones, we have Stealth Rogue Veils, Kurenai, the GPG. There's no reason not to run her, unless you're playing After Image. If you're playing After Image build, this is, by the way, this is the Break Ride build. This is pure Shiranui. So if you're running the After Image build, you are free to run the After Image PG. There is mechanic PG for this deck, surprisingly enough. It's also rare. Surprise, yeah, that's nice. She's the GPG, can only protect the Vanguard, but you get to countercharge 1, and that kind of matters, especially if you start using a lot of the more expensive strides more frequently. We have 4 Stride Fodder. He searches out Shiranui on call like a Stride Fodder ought to. And then we have a fairly controversial card, but often included. It's Tempest Stealth Rogue Fuuki. And he says, +1 puts you into your soul. If you have a Nubatama Vanguard and the number of cards in your opponent's hand is 3 or less, you may pay the cost. If you do, choose a card at random from your opponent's hand and bind it face down. At the end of the turn, the opponent puts the card bound by this effect into his or her hand. So the only problem with this card is, one, it gets rid of itself, and in a deck without a whole lot of boosters, as we're only playing 14 grade 1s, that starts to eat away your advantage. Thankfully, he's an act, not an on-call skill. If he was on-call, it's probably be unplayable right now. He's just mostly a 7k vanilla, because there are fairly few times that you actually get someone down to 3 cards or less. There is a way to do it with there's a pretty easy combo to pull off, but him also having a counterblast cost and a slide into soul cost, and the fact that this clan doesn't generate a whole lot of advantage on its own, it's mostly providing negative advantage or a disadvantage for your opponent. But if you have the cards and you can drop your opponent's hand to 2 cards, that's not bad, but really your Vanguard is the most dangerous thing on the board at any given time, so you probably won't use him a whole lot, but if you do, I hope it's devastating, because that's kind of what his intention was. And then we have the boy himself, the much better Fuuki, in my opinion, or the more general. It's a blast from not G, BT01, Dreadmaster. And +1, auto, rear. When this unit when an attack during the battle that this unit boosted, I knew that was right, a Nubatama, the number of cards in your hand is less than your opponent's, you may pay the cost, and if you do, your opponent chooses a card from his or her hand and discards it. Now, that is not bad at all. Yes, okay. So this happens before the guard step, and you just have to have less cards in your hand than your opponent, which you probably are, because all the clans in the world, except this one, draw a lot of cards. So that's probably an exaggeration, but no, you get the idea. This one doesn't draw a lot of cards. It mostly plays around discard, but then the mechanic was too strong. That's why it took this long for them to be supported anyway. Dreadmaster, optimal booster for any of your things that you put on the board. Make 16 lines is probably all you're going to achieve in this deck without a Onibidoushi. Onibidoushi. That's it. Finally getting the stand trigger name right. And really just making sure your opponent loses as many cards in their hand as possible. That's what you want. So that's all for the grade 1s. Moving on to the grade 2s, we start to see kind of where this clan comes together. We have Stealth Rogue of Nightfog Miyabi. She's the GB1 +1 when this unit is boosted and attacks Vanguard. Clone, the Amber Clone, as we call it. She gains +3000. Make sure I get this right. Number of cards in your hand is less than your opponent's. Choose a card at random for your opponent's hand, bind it face down. At the end of the turn, your opponent puts the card bound by this effect in the end of your hand. So a much less powerful version of discard. I personally think that, some clans' mechanics are just stronger than the cards, but not as strong as discard, and so there are grade 2s that, come into play, or Link Joker, and they just lock stuff. I feel like that's a lot more powerful card than what this clan was stuck with. But this pulls another card out of the hand, and it's on attack when boosted, so they're assuming you have less cards in hand, which if you use the combo of Shiranui plus Tsukumorakan, yeah. I'm having about as much trouble as I say today. But this just pulls another card out of the opponent's hand, and especially some of the stride bosses require a low amount of cards in the opponent's hand to work and really try and give the opponent out of the game. So this just helps with that. It's on boost. It's not too expensive at CP1, and you also have to attack the Vanguard. So that's neither here nor there. It's perfectly fine. We play her at 3 of because we like the other cards better, and we have space for 11. This is Stealth Beast Tamahagane. He says, on call, when this is played to Vanguard or Rearguard, important, that's also Vanguard thing. This is your ride, I guess. The other one could be the ride too. If you have a Nubatama Vanguard, choose one of your opponent's rearguards and bind it face up, and at the end of the turn, they put it in their hand. So this turns on the first phase of your removal really easily for free on call, so never a bad idea to put this guy on the board and bounce something you don't like to see, or... Well, it's not really bouncing. It does... This combos very well with Kamojigusa. If there's an especially annoying rearguard you don't want, say a Norol, a TikTok, a grade 2 that's providing too much advantage like a Nahalem, something like that. You can just get rid of it that way. The only problem is it requires 2 cards. This clan doesn't do anything particularly efficiently, and while it does have tools to pull those things out of the bind zone and into the drop zone, aside from Kamojigusa, the main one being Agitomaru right here, it's just not particularly efficient about the way it removes things. But Agitomaru does say, Vanguard or Rearguard, when this unit attack hits a Vanguard, choose up to one card from your opponent's bind zone and put it in the drop zone. So, again, if you hit a Vanguard with this card, you can pull a card out of the bind zone, drop it in the drop zone. That completes the retire or the discard, whichever it was that you picked, I guess, or had the opportunity to do. So while this has the potential to be better than retire, as it also includes discard for the same cost, it doesn't do as much as, say, some other clans might. But the fact that you have those options speaks for itself. Now moving to the grade 3s, this is Shura Stealth Dragon Kujikiricongo. Yeah, say that 5 times fast. He is the Break Ride, and he says, because it's a Break Ride, I want to make sure you get this right. Auto Limit Break 4, that's words I haven't said in a while. When a Nubatama rides this unit, choose your Vanguard, and until end of turn, that unit gets plus 10,000 power. Your opponent chooses one card from his or her hand, discard it. Then your opponent chooses one card from his or her hand and binds it face down. At the end of that turn, your opponent puts that card bound by this effect into his or her hand. So on Break Ride, it's a double, it's 1.5 discards. It's one full discard and one put a card from the hand into the bind zone, and then you can either get rid of it with Kamojigusa or Agitomaru, should you be given the chance. And then it has Lord, another skill we haven't seen in a while, and if it attacks, it gets plus 2,000 power. So not the worst, but you're only going to be making 20k lines with that at most, because all of the cards in here are 7ks. So this card, you can go into it first. There's a stride that allows you to first ride on top of specifically a Shura Stealth Dragon, this is the only one you play. So you can do some nasty Break Ride combos with this. It just depends on what you really want to do about it. So finally, the expensive one is Stealth Dragon Shiranui, and his GB2 says, when this unit attacks, so the number of cards in your hand is less than your opponent's, this unit gets power plus 5,000, plus 1 crit until end of turn. Yeah, it's great, easily guarded. Auto, Vanguard, counterblast 1. During your turn when your unit strides, haha, the money skill. You may pay the cost, and if you do, choose up to one of your opponent's rear guards, bind it face up. Your opponent chooses a card from his or her hand, discards it, and at the end of that turn, your opponent puts the card that's bound to this effect into his or her hand. So this is the effect that you'll be doing every turn to make sure your opponent's hand stays net from the last time they drew a card. So this pulls a card of the opponent's hand and binds the rear guard face up. Then you can use Kamojigusa and get rid of one of them. So you really, what this clan is trying to do is be a little bit of both discard and retire at the same time by putting it through the intermediary of the bind zone. It's alright. Going Break Ride into Shiranui into Stride could be potentially really fun, but also Break Riding by itself is something to be feared, as you get plus 15,000 power and a crit for doing almost nothing. So that's not a bad turn if you're willing to give up one drive check for that. But aside from that, we'll move straight into the strides, and it's really no issue if you have to go Shiranui first, because you're just striding and making your opponent discard cards, and that's what big attacks really do anyway. So on the off chance you are stuck on Kujikiricongo, you have Rikudo Stealth Dragon Jorurirakan. Yeah, it took me a few times to learn how to say it. And he says, Auto, Vanguard, counterblast 2. Little expensive, but he's a fighter select from Stride, so I don't know what you expected. When this unit attacks the Vanguard, you can pay the cost. If you do, choose one of your opponent's rear guards, bind it face up. Your opponent chooses a card from his or her hand, binds it face down. And if you have a heart card with Shura Stealth Dragon in its card name, at the end of that turn, put the cards that were bound by this effect into the drop zone. And if you do not, at the end of the turn, your opponent puts the cards that were bound with this effect into his or her hand. The card is really only useful if you're on the Break Ride, because it's discard and a retire in one for Counterblast 2. I guess that's okay. But if you're playing Counterblast 2 just to take things off the board or out of the hand temporarily, that's super wasteful. Especially if you go Shiranui into this, and that's Counterblast 3 for discard 2. One of those being temporary and a temporary, retire. So I'm not the biggest fan of this card. It's pretty good as a first ride if you get on Shura Stealth Dragon. So we run it as a 1-of, just to ensure that we get to do that sometimes, especially if it's super value for us to do so. So then we have, we're still running this, the on-hit stride Gedatsurakan. He says, on hit, your opponent chooses a card from his or her hand and discards it. That is all. It has to hit a Vanguard. Play it as a 2-of. It's pretty easy to go into. It creates that pressure. And going into any stride for CB1 is a discard off of Shiranui, so it's never really a bad idea to go into this, especially if nothing else looks quite as tasty, which sometimes it just doesn't. You're not ready to use your combo pieces just yet. Otherwise, he's good flip fodder. Moving on from that, we play to Gounrakan. Gounrakan, alright. And he says, for reference, auto, when this unit is placed on Vanguard, your opponent chooses 2 of his or her rear guards and binds all of his or her rear guards other than those units face up, and if 3 or more cards were bound, your opponent chooses 2 cards from his or her bind zone, puts them into the drop zone. And at the end of the turn, your opponent puts the cards bound with this effect into his or her hand. So, if your opponent has a full board, you can clear it off a little bit, get rid of 3 cards, get rid of 2 permanently. That's not bad at all. But I don't find myself going into this particularly often because I'm usually fighting for my life and making sure that my opponent continues to discard cards. So this comes in, at least this effect is free and it's on call. So if your opponent has a full board, you can make them discard 1 for CB1 with Shiranui, and then make them dump 2 things, assuming 3 or more cards are bound this way. So punish your opponent for having a full field, which you're going to see a lot as this. If you don't get your retire effects off, the rest of your retire effects off, you'll start seeing those rear guards again, and then they'll start to stack up. So, the bad boy of the deck himself, Rikudo Stealth Dragon Tsukumorakan, and he's probably the one that you're most scared of. He's GB2, Counterblast 2, and choose a face-down card from your G zone and flip it face up. You can pick really whatever. If you want to Shiranui first, pick Jorurirakan, you won't be using him. And this guy is the one that your opponent chooses 4 of his or her cards in hand and binds the rest face down and they return to the end of the turn. So, he's the one when you want to go in for game. Now, the thing about using this card is you'll stride, use his effect first, drop your opponent to 4 cards, then use Shiranui's skill, Counterblast 1, make them discard 1, and then they'll be stuck at 3 cards for the turn, and then you can use Fuuki. So that's the combo that I was talking about earlier. If you have the ability to absolutely kill your opponent, definitely go into this. The only problem is that they can PG the Vanguard and your rear guard units aren't strong enough, or you don't hit triggers. Can be a little bit concerning, but considering you should have a countercharge 1 off of Kamojigusa just about once a turn, and then you have GPGs doing the rest of the work, you should be flipping over enough to use him twice, which you can, as he doesn't require a persona flip. And then we have Rikudo Stealth Rogue, a Toggle Lord. Ooh, another big guy. And he's not the kill strike, he's more of the ace of the deck. The ace, like Dragon Corporal of the ace. He says, auto Vanguard GB2, Counterblast 1, choose a face-down card named Rikudo Stealth Mage, a Toggle Lord, hence why we play 4. Remember, G zone turn face up. When this unit attacks a Vanguard, you may pay the cost. If you do, your opponent chooses a card from his or her hand and binds it face down. Then, if the number of cards in your opponent's hand is 3 or less, this unit gets +1 crit until the end of that battle, and at the end of the turn, your opponent puts the card that was bound with this effect into his or her hand. So, using your other effects like Dreadmaster, like Shiranui, and this guy, you can try and take assuming they had like 7 or fewer, there might be a chance you can get them down to 3 cards. Especially if you attack with some rear guards first, hence we're playing stand triggers. And you can get the extra crit off this guy. If they have 3 or less cards in hand, hopefully they're taking that damage, but hopefully you put them in a position where they can't, and that's how you win the game. Aside from the Tsukumorakan combo, which is a little more costly. But that's about how the strides work. You can go into this after GB2, after you either G-Guard play first stride, of which the ones we have are pretty alright. I mean, it's still a non-hit, we're waiting on more strides. Please, Nubatama support, please. Ooh. G711 maybe? There's nothing wrong with this guy, and honestly, sometimes I just go into him because I want, to put the pressure on and see if my opponent will go down to 3 cards, because you can activate his effect on attack. And thankfully, it's not an actor. He'd be much worse in my opinion. And then we have our friend, a Sea Breeze, because this deck is fairly G-reliant, especially in the... If the game gets stressed out, we can't make our opponents discard cards. We might be in a bad way, and so we definitely have the room for a Sea Breeze, especially because we don't need 4 of Tsukumorakan. You will never use him that much. And for the G-Guards, we have 2 of the Fighters Collection G-Guard, Taishi, and they say, when this unit is placed on guard, if the number of cards in your opponent's hand is 6 or less, this unit gets power plus 5,000 till end of battle. So hopefully you've been doing your work and keeping your opponent's hand low, but if not, well, at least it's a 15k guard. But for when that's not okay, we still have a Scryu, just in case you need that nice and 25k guard. Give me up to 36, please. And in case I start hunting your all-important rear guards, there's a Dismal. So that is our Nubatama deck profile. Thanks for tuning in. Team Absolution, peace.